"You can't be serious," Torak said, his laughter cutting through the heavy silence like a serrated blade. His voice, deep and reverberating, rumbled in the cold, metallic chamber, echoing off the gleaming walls. The alien's mandibles twitched in amusement, eyes glinting with an almost predatory edge. He stood towering over the humans, a hulking figure of dark exoskeleton armor and sharp, angular features, as though he were a creature straight out of a nightmare. "A human fleet? You think you can stand against us?" Commander Jarek Kalem, standing rigid with his arms folded, forced himself not to flinch. The laughter was like nails on glass, scraping at his nerves, but he didn't let it show. His eyes stayed locked on Torak, calculating the weight of every word, every gesture. The Visari commander's arrogance was almost as suffocating as the sterile air filling the room. "We're not here to fight you, Torak," Jarek said, his voice low but steady, punctuated by the steady beat of his pulse in his ears. "But don't mistake our restraint for weakness." Torak let out another chuckle, the sound as hollow and cold as a tomb. "Restraint? You think you can negotiate with us? Your species doesn't even understand how to wield power. Your so-called military? Pathetic. It's laughable." Beside Jarek, the faint glow of the laser plasma displays flickered in sync with Torak's voice, the words dancing across the screen like shards of broken glass. Each word they exchanged made the air feel heavier, the walls pressing in on him, the buzz of electronic equipment at his back buzzing in his skull. He could almost taste the tension in the room, a sour metallic flavor that clung to the tongue. His colleague, Lieutenant Kira Solis, stood off to his left, her eyes narrowed, her fingers twitching near the console. She didn't speak, but Jarek could feel the heat coming off her. Her thoughts and frustrations mirrored his own. The slight rustling of her uniform, as she adjusted her posture, was the only indication of her unease. They both knew the stakes. They were standing on the precipice of a conflict that could decide the fate of humanity. But here they were, being ridiculed by these alien overlords, as though their very presence didn't matter. "It seems," Torak continued, his voice a rasping snarl, "that Earth's ambitions have grown, but your reach still falls short. You can't even properly defend your colonies, and yet you come here, demanding respect?" Jarek could feel Kira's restraint, but there was a flicker of anger in her eyes. She wanted to strike back, to shout, but she knew better. The Visari only respected power, and power wasn't something humanity could afford to show recklessly. Not yet. "Respect isn't something we ask for, Torak," Jarek said, his voice cutting through the alien's mockery with razor-sharp clarity. His hands remained relaxed by his sides, but his fingers were tense, the muscles beneath his uniform taut as he fought the impulse to reach for his sidearm. The room felt too small now, the air too thick. The sharp scent of recycled oxygen tinged with the faint taste of coolant stung his nostrils. "It's something we demand, and you will give it to us." The room seemed to shrink further as Torak's laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by a long, drawn-out hum of anticipation, as if the alien were contemplating Jarek's words. He watched as Torak's insectoid eyes narrowed, analyzing him. The walls of the conference room hummed softly, the heads-up displays blinking sporadically with data that seemed so insignificant compared to the magnitude of the moment. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, do you?" Torak's voice dropped low, each word heavy with disdain. "You humans are nothing more than children in the galactic game. You have no place among us, no place among the stars." A sharp, metallic clang broke through the tension. The door at the back of the room slid open, and an aide stepped forward, handing Jarek a small data pad, interrupting the standoff. Jarek's gaze flicked to the device, and his brow furrowed as he read the message. It was brief, encoded, and only meant for his eyes. He looked up at Torak, a slight glimmer of a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "The stars are within our reach now, Torak. Your words are empty. We're not asking permission to sit at your table anymore. We've earned the right to stand in the same room as you, and we will make you see that," Jarek replied, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. The words echoed against the metallic surfaces, heavy, sharp. Torak's eyes flashed, anger, disbelief, maybe even the first stirrings of fear, but he quickly masked it, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "You think we fear you?" He stepped closer, his massive bulk looming over Jarek, casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the room. The heavy scent of something metallic, almost like rust, wafted off his armor. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Jarek's pulse quickened, but he kept his gaze steady. "I don't expect you to fear us," he said, "but you will respect us. We've learned from the mistakes of the past. We're no longer the species you can laugh at, Thorak." The Viceroy commander sneered but then turned sharply, his long limbs stretching out in a fluid motion. He moved towards the laser plasma display, his gaze flicking over the data as if it were nothing more than an afterthought, a mere inconvenience. "I'll give you a warning, human," Thorak said, his voice now colder than ice. "Play your hand too soon and you will find the galaxy isn't as forgiving as you believe." Jarek remained unmoving, watching him. Kira shifted slightly, sensing the tension ebbing out of the room. The quiet beep of the datapad in Jarek's hand was almost deafening in the silence that followed. He hadn't given up yet. "No, Thorak. You'll learn the hard way," Jarek said, his voice calm, but filled with an undeniable force. "The galaxy is changing, and humans will be a force you'll have to reckon with. This isn't about asking. This is about taking what's ours." Thorak spun on his heel, his armored back to them, but for the first time since the meeting began, there was no laugh, no arrogant comment, just a long, deliberate silence. The doors slid shut behind him, leaving a heavy, almost suffocating stillness in its wake. The space felt cold, the silence so thick that even the faint noise from the outer decks couldn't cut through it. Kira's breath, steady but quick, broke the stillness. "That went differently than I expected." Jarek didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the spot where Thorak had stood moments before. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. "No," he murmured, barely a whisper. "This is only the beginning." The doors to the chamber closed with a hiss, sealing off the alien mockery like the final clang of a prison gate. Commander Jarek Kalem remained standing in the center of the room, his fists clenched at his sides. The air around him felt charged, thick with the sting of frustration. The laser plasma displays hummed gently, casting an eerie light that flickered against the sharp edges of the conference table. The room still reeked of Thorak's presence, like the lingering taste of a bitter herb. Kira Solis stood quietly beside him, her eyes locked on the now silent display. She didn't say anything, but Jarek could feel the weight of her thoughts. She was disappointed. No, angry. They both were. Yet deep in the pit of his stomach, Jarek knew that their work wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Not exactly the reception we were hoping for," Kira said, her voice quieter than usual, almost distant. Her fingers hovered over the controls of her terminal, but she didn't press anything. The faint smell of synthetic leather from her gloves mixed with the sterile scent of the room, the air too clean, too clinical. Jarek turned to her, his expression hard. "We'll make them listen. We have no choice." Her eyes met his, the sharp glint of determination in them making her words hit with force. "That wasn't just arrogance, Jarek. There's something else there, something they're not telling us." He nodded, taking a deep breath. The Visari were more than just an obstacle. They were a complex puzzle, and every interaction with them added pieces he wasn't sure he wanted to put together. But he had to, for humanity's sake. Jarek's thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime from his wristband. He looked down to see the heads-up display flicker to life. A message from Earth's Intelligence Division. He read it quickly, feeling a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "We've found something," he muttered, scrolling through the message. "There's a dead language, one that predates even the Visari's rise to power. It's similar to what Thorak reacted to." Kira moved closer, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? How does that help us?" Jarek's mind raced. He tapped the screen, pulling up ancient files that he had barely glanced at before. The language wasn't something the Visari had simply forgotten. It was buried, hidden beneath layers of time and war. And it wasn't just a language. It was a weapon. It's a communication system, one that the Visari once feared, Jarek explained, his fingers brushing over the data as the characters began to flicker across the plasma display. The text was alien, ancient, the symbols flowing with an eerie elegance. This language, this dead language, was used by a species the Visari wiped out. They feared it, Kira, and the language holds power, power they never wanted anyone to unlock. Kira stared at the screen for a long moment, processing the weight of his words. She finally broke the silence with a quiet, "We can't use this. It's too much. We're talking about something that could unravel their entire empire." Jarek's gaze didn't waver. "Exactly. And that's why they're laughing. They don't think we know what we're doing. But this will change the balance. The language holds power, Kira. Power to disrupt their entire military system, their political structures. We just have to unlock it." A low thrum vibrated through the walls, faint but steady, like the pulse of a distant storm. Kira shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking to the door as if expecting the Visari to storm in at any moment. The temperature in the room had shifted, becoming thick and uncomfortable, the air too dry, the metal of the walls almost oppressive. "The plan's simple," Jarek said, shaking off the feeling of unease. He turned away from the terminal, pacing in the small confines of the room. "We learn the language. We broadcast it during the next engagement. The Visari won't know what hit them." Kira was silent for a moment, her fingers still hovering over the terminal. The space between them seemed to thicken, and for a moment Jarek felt the weight of his own words settle on him like a cloak. Was he really prepared to wield such a weapon? Was humanity ready for what would come next? "I've trained soldiers for years," Kira said finally, her voice colder now. "But even this, it's madness. Do we have any idea what we're dealing with? We don't know what effect this language will have." Jarek stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto hers. He could hear the subtle strain in her voice, but he couldn't afford hesitation. Not now. "We don't need to understand it fully," he said, his tone sharp. "We just need to make them listen. This is the leverage we need." Kira nodded slowly, but Jarek could see the doubt still clouding her eyes. She was right to hesitate. They were treading on dangerous ground, and the stakes had just been raised. "We'll need a team," Kira said, her gaze flicking back to the display. "Linguists, military tacticians, experts in psychological warfare. We can't afford mistakes." Jarek's mind clicked into place. The plan was already forming in the back of his head, each piece slotting together. The Visari's arrogance was their weakness, but it wasn't enough to just show them power. They needed something more, something that would shake them to their core, something they couldn't ignore. He turned back to her, his jaw set. "We begin the training tomorrow. We don't wait." Kira's lips tightened, but she didn't argue. She knew, just as he did, that waiting wasn't an option. The Visari would only grow stronger, more arrogant, more dangerous, and Jarek wasn't about to give them that chance. The hours that followed were spent in quiet deliberation, the faint hum of activity in the command center fading into the background as they began organizing the operation. The tension in the air was palpable, and every beep of a console felt like a hammer striking the anvil. Jarek stared at the laser plasma display once more, the ancient text now a constant presence at the edge of his thoughts. He could almost hear it, like an echo beneath the surface of the chaos, a whisper that told him humanity was on the edge of something far greater than they realized. But even as the pieces of the plan fell into place, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were playing a game they didn't fully understand, a game with rules they were still learning to read. As he left the room, Kira at his side, Jarek couldn't help but glance back at the flickering symbols on the screen. The ancient language was calling to him, a siren song that promised power but threatened ruin. The Visari would never see it coming. The Visari shipyard was nothing like Earth's colonies, sleek and imposing, its colossal frames bathed in the light of distant stars. The air around Jarek Kalem seemed too thin, the space too expansive, despite the intricate weave of the Visari engineering enveloping the docks. Massive structures loomed like silent giants, reflecting the faint glow of laser plasma displays that blinked erratically with the ebb and flow of ongoing operations. The hum of distant activity seemed to pulse from every corner of the facility, but it felt empty, as though the station's heart was still waiting for something, waiting for a spark. And Jarek had brought that spark with him. He glanced at the faces of his crew, their expressions unreadable but their bodies taut with anticipation. Kira, always steady at his side, didn't need to look at him for him to sense the questions swirling in her mind. Even in the midst of their preparations, she was calculating, evaluating, always 10 steps ahead. The ship's walls, dull and cold underfoot, gave off a faint metallic taste in the air, sterile, but uncomfortably suffocating. They'd chosen the shipyard not just for its strategic location, but for the Visari's overconfidence. They were too accustomed to unchallenged dominance in this sector. That, Jarek thought, was their mistake. 5 minutes, Kira's voice broke through his thoughts, cool and measured, as she tapped the heads-up display. The countdown started on the screen before her, a red blinking light marking time like a heartbeat. "I know," he replied, his voice tight. His stomach churned, though he showed no sign of it. The plan had been set in motion, but doubt still gnawed at the edges of his resolve. They'd be outnumbered, vastly so, but they had the element of surprise. They would make it count. The plan was simple enough on paper. Disable the primary control center, divert communications, and slip away before the Visari could react. But the Visari were anything but predictable, and every plan was a gamble. The dead language, used as an unassuming vector, would be their weapon, subtly introduced in the confusion. The system was rigged, but the Visari had no idea that the command codes they trusted would betray them. Jarek's eyes flicked over the crew in the corridor. Lieutenant Colwyn and Sergeant Doran moved with swift purpose, loading the final gear into their combat packs. The laser plasma displays illuminated their faces, giving them an almost ghostly appearance, their eyes shadowed by the intense blue glow of the screens. A few of the others whispered between themselves, but the tension was thick, too thick to allow for idle conversation. Each footstep they took echoed through the silent hull of the ship, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. They were prepared for this. They had to be. What happens if this doesn't work? Colwyn's voice was low, but Jarek heard it, the edge of concern buried beneath his otherwise stoic tone. He had to ask. It was only human to doubt. They had all felt the weight of what they were about to do. Jarek didn't look at him as he answered, keeping his eyes fixed on the glowing terminal in front of him. "Then we don't leave. We make sure they remember who's really in charge." Kira shot him a brief, disapproving glance before returning to the mission specs. The laser plasma display blinked again, signaling that the countdown was at 1 minute. The silence in the shipyard was suffocating, as though everything was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Jarek's boots scraped softly against the floor, but every step felt like a drumbeat in the cavernous silence. "We're in position," Kira confirmed, her voice calm, betraying no hint of nerves. "Engines primed, cloaking active. We're good to go." The heads-up display in front of him blinked green. Jarek allowed himself a single, short breath before stepping forward. The plan had begun. The corridors of the Visari shipyard stretched on like a maze of cold, metallic veins, their walls lined with slithering cables and blinking terminals. The guards were few, scattered in the vastness of the station, but they were efficient. Each step was calculated, each corner cleared with the precision of soldiers who had trained for this moment. Jarek's fingers tingled with the anticipation of what was to come. Everything in him screamed that they were moments away from the Visari, realizing they had underestimated humanity. They reached the control center. The quiet tension reached a crescendo as Jarek glanced back to check on his team, each of them poised and ready. The control center door loomed before them, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed out of place for a military outpost. Jarek could feel the beat of his pulse in his throat as he stepped toward it. One final sweep. One last breath before the storm hit. "Now," he muttered. Kira stepped forward with him, hacking into the system. The laser plasma display overhead flickered and glowed as she worked quickly, her fingers flying across the interface. There was no time for hesitation. With a soft chime, the door slid open. Inside, the control center stretched out before them, rows of terminals, each one manned by a lone Visari operator who was too busy with their own tasks to notice the intruders. The air smelled of metal and oil, thick with the buzz of technology running at full capacity. The floor beneath their boots was slick, and the sound of their footsteps reverberated, louder than they should have been in the cavernous space. Without hesitation, Jarek moved. The first guard went down with a soft thud, too quick to be noticed. Kira followed his movements, her motions graceful and deliberate, neutralizing the second with equal efficiency. The rest of the team spread out, silently disabling terminals, planting charges, and ensuring that there were no backups. The Visari would never see it coming. The perfect blend of ancient strategy and human cunning. But as they completed their tasks, something began to shift in the air. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, an odd change in the pitch of the ambient hum, a sudden flicker in the lights. It felt like the shipyard was reacting to something, but Jarek couldn't place it. The terminal's blinking lights flickered again, this time more violently, and a cold chill swept through the room. Then, the first explosion rang out, distant but unmistakable. The control center shuddered, and the walls rattled. The Visari had sensed the breach. "What the hell was that?" Doran's voice broke the silence. "Just stay focused," Jarek snapped. He looked around the room, scanning every terminal and readout with increasing intensity. The lasers from the displays cast stark shadows across his face as his thoughts raced. This wasn't part of the plan. The faint smell of burning wiring reached his nostrils, cutting through the mechanical odor of the control room. His stomach tightened, and a strange gnawing sensation settled in his gut. The Visari were about to retaliate. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. "Get the last set of codes and move out," Jarek ordered, his voice tight as he turned toward the doorway. But before they could leave, a loud, blaring siren echoed through the corridors, a sound that could shatter even the most resolute soldiers. The Visari had found them. "This isn't over," Jarek said, the weight of his words settling over the team like a stone. There was no turning back now. The countdown to their next move had already begun. The siren's wail echoed through the corridors, a brutal reminder of the danger that now pressed in on them. Jarek's heart thundered against his chest as his boots slapped against the metal floors, each step louder than the last. The vibrations beneath his feet matched the tightening in his gut. The walls seemed to close in, their cold steel now an overwhelming presence. There was no time to waste. They had made their move, but it had come at a cost. Something was wrong, and the Visari were already responding. Kira's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and focused. "We've triggered the secondary defenses. They're on their way." Jarek glanced over his shoulder. She was right. Her fingers worked furiously over the heads-up display, frantically inputting commands to reroute their exit path. The faint clicks of her fingers against the panel sounded like gunshots in the stillness, sharp and deliberate. Her face was set in stone, every muscle taut, but there was a flash of uncertainty in her eyes. It wasn't fear, but the kind of doubt that every leader had at one point in a mission. Doubt that crept in when you couldn't control the variables anymore. "Move!" Jarek barked. His voice was low but urgent, every syllable a command. "We can't let them trap us here." The team split into two groups, each member moving swiftly, efficiently. Every member knew their task: get to the extraction point, plant the charges, and be gone before the Visari could mobilize their counterstrike. But as Jarek reached the corner of the hallway, the floor beneath him trembled again, this time more violently. The metallic reverberation was almost physical, as though the shipyard itself was breathing, preparing to retaliate. He glanced at the laser plasma displays mounted along the walls, but the flickering numbers meant nothing in the face of the danger creeping closer. "Something's wrong," Kira muttered, as she keyed in another sequence on her console. "They're already targeting us. They've seen the breach. They're locking down the perimeter." Jarek swallowed, trying to suppress the adrenaline that surged in his chest. He could feel the walls closing in, the urgency thickening the air around him. They had one shot, and if they failed... He didn't finish the thought. Not yet. He couldn't. A sudden jolt rocked the shipyard, and the soft hum of the surroundings turned into a crackling tension in the air. The Visari were too efficient, too fast. It was clear they had been expecting something. Perhaps not this, but something. They had underestimated humanity, but the Visari had a way of turning every advantage back against you. Jarek knew that now, intimately. "Lorne, where are the backup generators?" Jarek asked, voice tight as the echoes of heavy footsteps drew nearer. His eyes darted toward the overhead laser plasma display again, and the words, "Access denied," flashed like a warning beacon. "On the far side of the station, not far." Lorne's voice was steady, though it carried the weight of mounting pressure. "But we need to move faster." Another tremor shook the deck, followed by a burst of noise that made the lights flicker. The Visari had already activated their secondary defense systems, now lighting up the station's narrow hallways with bright, disorienting beams. It was a full-scale lockdown. Everything they had done up until now was part of the game. They were now just pawns in a larger fight. Jarek's grip tightened on his weapon. He could hear the echoes of their footsteps. The Visari soldiers were closing in, and he knew that each one would be a trap. Every corner could hide an ambush. They had underestimated their enemies, but now they would pay for that mistake. "We're running out of time," Kira said, snapping Jarek from his thoughts. They turned a corner just as the Visari forces emerged from a maintenance tunnel. The harsh glow of their armor illuminated their long, insectoid features. Jarek barely had time to adjust before they were in range. He cursed under his breath. "Get down!" Jarek yelled, pulling Kira to the floor, his reflexes acting before his mind had time to process. The sharp hiss of a plasma blast flew just overhead, narrowly missing them. The sound was hot and violent, tearing through the space like a thunderclap. The Visari soldiers, their sleek exoskeletons glinting in the low light, advanced quickly, their weapons raised and trained on the humans. But Jarek wasn't backing down. He met their advance head-on, eyes narrowing, the familiar, pulsing hum of the weapon systems coming online in his mind. The plasma guns felt heavy in his hands, but he had to move faster than ever. "Return fire!" Jarek barked, and his team responded in unison. A perfect shot, echoing in the hallway as a Visari soldier fell to the ground in a spray of dark fluid. The air smelled of sweat and burning metal, the acrid scent of plasma filling their lungs as the battle erupted around them. Each shot fired was a gamble, and the stakes were rising with every passing second. A heavy crackling sound filled the room as another shot from the Visari soldiers ripped through the air, grazing Lorne's side. He staggered but didn't fall, grimacing only for a second before continuing to fire. "Keep moving," Kira shouted, ducking behind the nearby console to reload. Her face was pale, but determination burned in her eyes. "We need to get to the backup generators, now!" Jarek's head snapped toward her. "I know," he growled, "but we're not leaving until the charges are set. We're not running from them anymore. We fight." Another burst of plasma lit the hallway, and Jarek's eyes instinctively narrowed. The team was now pinned down, but they had the advantage of surprise on their side. Even if the Visari outnumbered them, they hadn't yet adapted to their unpredictability. That was their edge. Jarek motioned toward Lorne, signaling him to flank left. They needed to divide their enemies, isolate them. Lorne nodded sharply, and in a synchronized movement, he darted to the side, opening fire as he moved. The rest of the team followed suit, spreading out as the Visari scrambled to reorient themselves. The walls shook again, a deeper tremor this time, as the Visari attempted to activate the station's automated turrets. Jarek's mind raced. He had to end this before the turrets came online. He couldn't let them turn the station into a fortress. "Shut them down," Jarek ordered, as the proximity alarm blared in the background. "Find those control terminals." "We're on it," Kira replied immediately, her voice biting through the noise. "Cover us." The team charged forward, their boots a steady, rhythmic beat against the floor as they pushed through the Visari forces. The laser plasma displays flashed urgently ahead of them as if warning them that each second brought them closer to being overwhelmed. Jarek's mind was a whirlwind of strategy, each move calculated yet instinctive. They were close now, closer than ever to the station's core, where the real battle would begin. And in the back of his mind, one thought gnawed at him. This was only the beginning. The Visari retaliation was swift, and there was no guarantee they would make it out alive. The mystery of their strength, of their ancient fear of the dead language, was still unraveling. What had they triggered with the words Jarek had spoken? What force had they set in motion? There was only one way to find out. Jarek's boots clicked sharply against the station's hard surface, the echo of each step amplifying the weight of the situation. The air smelled faintly of charred metal and scorched wires, and the cold stench of fear lingered. The Visari had begun their retaliation in earnest, their mechanized forces flooding into the corridors. The room around him pulsed with the rhythmic glow of the laser plasma displays, each flickering with new intelligence as the team pushed deeper into the station. The countdown was fast approaching its final moments, and their window of opportunity was shrinking with every passing second. Kira was beside him, her posture rigid, eyes scanning the heads-up display as she adjusted the team's next move. Her brow was furrowed, the strain of the mission evident in her tight jaw and clenched fists. She didn't speak, but her silence was a loud statement. She was just as unsettled by the unfolding events as Jarek, though neither of them would admit it aloud. "We're close," Kira muttered, breaking the silence, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "But we've got incoming." The plasma display blinked, showing the schematic of the station's security grid. The corridors were flashing red, and Jarek felt a pang of frustration. The Visari had adapted faster than expected, and the pressure of the situation bore down on him like a vice. "We don't have time for this," Jarek said, the words leaving his mouth in a low growl. "We need to reach the central terminal now, or everything we've done will be for nothing." Kira didn't reply, but Jarek could see the fire in her eyes. She was already formulating a way around the new lockdown, her mind working behind the calm exterior. Her fingers flicked across the laser plasma display as she accessed the schematics once more, typing furiously. The station quivered as a low, rumbling sound filled the air. A warning siren went off, blaring harshly, making Jarek's ears ring. The Visari were mobilizing their full force now. The lights flickered, throwing the station into a strobing darkness, making the sense of urgency even sharper. His pulse hammered in his throat as the distant screech of Visari war machines grew louder. The station was no longer just a facility, it was a battleground, and he had to find the heart of it before the battle consumed them. "Left side," Kira said, snapping him from his thoughts. "We can bypass through there." Jarek nodded, his boots pounding against the cold metal floors as he followed her lead. The hallways stretched before them, narrow and sterile, lit only by the flickering lights of their equipment. The hum of weapon systems charging up reverberated through the walls, and Jarek could almost feel the pulse of each weapon's preparation in his bones. The air was thick with tension, and every movement seemed to ripple out in slow motion. They were walking into enemy territory. Stealth was no longer an option, and the Visari had undoubtedly noticed the breach. As they rounded the corner, Jarek's eyes caught the movement just as Kira raised her weapon. The first Visari soldier appeared from the shadows, his silhouette sharp against the glow of the display behind him. His elongated mandibles twitched, but he didn't hesitate. A plasma blast shot out from his weapon, and the acrid smell of heated metal filled the air. Kira ducked, the shot missing by inches, but the force of it knocked her to the side. "Take him down!" Jarek barked, already moving, his body reacting before his mind could fully process the threat. His weapon flared to life in his hands, a blue streak of light cutting through the air, hitting the soldier squarely in the chest. The impact sent the Visari soldier crashing to the ground in a heap of broken limbs, the smell of burning armor filling the air. Kira wasted no time. She was already moving forward, scanning the hallway for any more threats. Her movements were fluid, efficient, no wasted energy. Jarek admired that about her. In a crisis, she never hesitated. They were a team, and that knowledge was their greatest advantage. "We're too exposed," Kira said, pulling Jarek from his thoughts once more. Her voice was sharp, and he could hear the edge of worry creeping into her tone. "We need to move faster." The laser plasma display flickered, signaling that their route was no longer clear. Another enemy unit was on the move, and they would be trapped in the corridor if they didn't act quickly. Jarek's eyes darted to the display, then to Kira. His mind raced, but he quickly formulated a new plan. "Push through the vents. It'll be faster," Jarek said. His eyes locked onto Kira's, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Kira nodded, already moving to the maintenance hatch nearby. Her fingers worked quickly, her breath coming faster now as she opened the vent cover. The smell of oil and dust billowed out, a sharp contrast to the sterile air of the station, but Jarek didn't hesitate. He climbed in first, feeling the cold metal walls press against his skin as he made his way into the tight, claustrophobic space. Kira followed closely behind, the soft clatter of her boots echoing in the narrow tunnel. It felt like an eternity, crawling through the cramped passageways. The faint taste of stale air lingered at the back of Jarek's throat, and the sound of his breathing echoed too loudly in the narrow vents. The walls scraped against his elbows as they hurried forward, every movement making the space feel even tighter. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. "Almost there," Kira's voice came through the comms, her tone tight but controlled. Jarek couldn't shake the feeling that the Visari had expected this. They had to have known something was coming. They were reacting too quickly. He reached for the small device at his waist, a tracking signal, a last-ditch measure to confirm their location. As the screen flickered to life, he couldn't help but notice the anomaly, a signature far too close. "Stay down," Jarek warned, his voice low, tinged with urgency. His fingers twitched around the weapon at his side. The Visari weren't far behind, and they were closing in on their position with frightening speed. The walls groaned as something heavy passed through them, the sound echoing throughout the narrow tunnel. The floor vibrated beneath them, a soft tremor that reverberated through the air. "What is that?" Kira asked, her voice low but filled with disbelief. "I don't know," Jarek replied, his eyes narrowing. "But we need to move now." The air felt colder suddenly, almost as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees, and Jarek realized the stakes had just escalated beyond anything they had prepared for. The Visari were adapting, learning faster than he could keep up. This wasn't just a tactical assault anymore. It was a race against time. They crawled faster, every breath heavy, every movement calculated. Jarek's fingers gripped the cold metal of the vent as the clattering of the Visari's footsteps grew louder in the distance. Something told him they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were about to unleash a power that even the Visari didn't understand. The vent grate snapped shut with a sharp clang behind them, sealing off the chaos of the station's halls as Jarek and Kira crawled through the cramped maintenance tunnel. The air inside felt stagnant, the taste of recycled oxygen thick with metal dust. Each breath burned his lungs as they moved, the walls pressing in so tight that every shift of his shoulders sent a ripple through the narrow passage. The disorienting low vibrations of the station, once so distant, now felt like a looming threat. The distant echoes of Visari soldiers grew fainter, but not fast enough. They were in a race now, a race for control, for survival. "We're almost there," Kira whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hiss of their comms. Her hand brushed against his, the touch brief, a silent reassurance. Her fingers were ice cold, and Jarek felt a flicker of unease in his gut. The pressure had mounted in ways neither of them had expected. Jarek's eyes scanned the laser plasma display on his wrist, tracking the ever-closing signatures of the Visari forces. They were closer now, far closer. "Just a little more. Stay sharp," he muttered, voice tight with the urgency that clung to every word. The tunnel twisted ahead, the harsh glow of the plasma display casting ghostly shadows across the metal. The metallic scent of the walls clung to his senses as they turned another corner. Each movement felt slower, more labored. They weren't just fighting against the Visari now. They were fighting against the very time that slipped from their fingers with every step. A low rumble came through the walls, vibrating the floor beneath them. Jarek paused. His heart skipped. his breath hitching in his chest. The tremor wasn't natural. The walls were vibrating with the weight of something massive, something that wasn't part of the station's usual operations. "What is that?" Kira's voice was low but sharp, her eyes flicking to the laser plasma display once more. "It's not a Visari patrol. They're not moving like soldiers." Jarek didn't answer immediately. The weight of the moment pressed on him, thick and suffocating. The vibration rippled again, now stronger. The walls groaned in response, as if the entire station were responding to an unseen force. A low frequency that resonated deep in his chest, making the hairs on his neck stand up. He could almost feel it inside his bones. Something was moving. They crept forward, the air growing heavier with each breath. The laser plasma display flickered erratically, a glitch in the matrix. The words on the screen shifted into static for a moment before snapping back to life, revealing a disturbing pattern. The Visari were not alone anymore. "What?" Kira's voice cracked the silence, her words dripping with disbelief. "Jarek, look at this." Jarek's pulse quickened as he leaned over, his hand brushing against her shoulder as he focused on the display. The signatures had multiplied. A dozen, maybe more. Alien signatures unlike anything they had seen before. The static cleared, replaced by sharp, clear imagery. Something massive was descending upon the station. Something that hadn't been accounted for in their intel. The cold weight of realization hit Jarek like a brick. It wasn't just the Visari anymore. They were facing an unknown enemy, something, or someone, moving in with precision. They had to be ready. "What the hell is that?" Jarek muttered, his voice tight. "Who is that?" Kira was already moving, her fingers flying across the display, trying to analyze the data faster than her mind could process it. The information wasn't coming fast enough. "We need to get to the control center," Jarek said, urgency rising in his voice. "Now!" With no time to waste, they pushed forward again. The station's walls seemed to pulse with every step, the vibrations growing stronger, the air thicker. Every corner they turned, every passage they crawled through, felt more constricting, the walls closing in. The distant rumble that had once felt like a faint tremor now felt like a suffocating presence in the station's very bones. The sound of the Visari soldiers grew louder again, closer, far too close for comfort. The air was no longer silent. Their footsteps reverberated against the metal walls, and Jarek could hear the muted mechanical clang of their weapons being drawn. They were almost on top of them. "Move! Move!" Kira hissed. Her words clipped, her breath fast and shallow. The look in her eyes had shifted. No longer was she calm. The pressure had cracked the surface, revealing the tension beneath it. Jarek felt it too. The moment of hesitation, the split second of weakness, was gone. He surged forward, grabbing Kira's arm and pulling her along, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. Each moment felt like an eternity. The Visari were closing in, but Jarek had one thing they didn't: an unyielding will to survive. They broke into a wide-open junction, a hallway leading to the central control center, but it was far from empty. Visari soldiers flooded the space, their insectoid figures towering over them. Plasma fire erupted from their weapons, splitting the air with violent flashes of blue light. Jarek ducked instinctively, pulling Kira with him into cover. The air crackled with energy, the tang of heated metal and ozone filling his nostrils. "We're outgunned!" Kira snapped, the weight of the situation settling in. "Then we'll have to outthink them," Jarek gritted out, his eyes darting around the space. The Visari were too many, but the control center was close. They were almost there. The walls of the corridor suddenly shook again, and a shudder ran through Jarek's body. Something massive moved through the walls again. Closer now. The display flickered once more, showing a new pattern. A massive form was emerging from deep within the station, its presence so overwhelming that even the Visari faltered. "What is that?" Kira's voice trembled as she watched the display. Her face had drained of color, eyes wide with confusion. The sheer size of the unknown force was enough to make even the Visari halt in their tracks. "It's not one of theirs," Jarek said, his words strained. "Whatever it is, it's coming straight for us." The tremors in the station had escalated to something far more violent now. The walls around them groaned under the pressure, their foundations shaking. Jarek's mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan. This was something else entirely. He couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that crawled up his spine. As they took cover, the display blinked again, showing an ominous, flashing signal. An unknown signal that only seemed to appear when certain conditions were met. Jarek's heart skipped. The signal was too familiar, too dangerous. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something far greater. Jarek's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as the unknown signal flashed again across the laser plasma displays. The blinking red light seemed to pulse with an ominous life of its own, filling the corridor with a sickly glow. Kira's eyes flicked to the display, then back to Jarek, her face pale, but determined. There was no turning back now. The Visari had underestimated them before, but this new threat, this massive, unaccountable force, had shifted everything. The plan they'd set in motion was no longer a simple raid. It had become a full-scale engagement, and the stakes were rising with every passing moment. "We need to act now," Kira whispered, her voice tight. Her fingers hovered over her wristband, her gaze scanning the chaotic network of signals and fluctuating numbers. She wasn't just fighting the Visari now, she was fighting time itself. If we don't neutralize this new signal, the Visari will not hesitate to wipe us out. Jarek nodded sharply, his pulse quickening as the weight of their predicament settled over him. The unknown force wasn't just an anomaly, it was a game-changer, a force that could tip the scales in the Visari's favor. They needed to shut it down before it could do any real damage. The station trembled beneath them, another violent rumble that made the walls groan in protest. Jarek's senses heightened, and the taste of fear, sharp and bitter, settled at the back of his throat. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his weapon, every muscle coiled and ready. "We push forward," he said, his voice low but firm. "We get to the control center, now." Kira glanced at him, her face set with resolve. "And then what?" Jarek's eyes locked onto the blinking red lights of the laser plasma display, the eerie rhythm of the signal still pulsing through the air. His mind raced, calculating their next move, formulating the best strategy to neutralize the threat. "We intercept the signal, disable the Visari's automated systems, and take control. If we don't, we're not getting out of here alive." The words were harsh, but they were reality. They had no other choice. He turned toward the control center, his feet sure but fast, the sound of his boots against the floor echoing through the narrow passage. Kira fell into step beside him, her gaze flicking to the hallways around them, assessing every angle, every potential trap the Visari might spring on them. The air felt thick now, charged with the urgency of their mission. The distant clattering of Visari boots was a constant reminder that they were being hunted. Their every move was now under watch, their every decision carrying the weight of 1,000 possible outcomes. The walls closed in with every step, the station's sterile atmosphere pressing in on them from all sides. Jarek felt the adrenaline surge, sharp and quick, as they neared the control center. The unmistakable buzz of Visari weapons firing in the distance reminded him of the battle ahead. The moment they opened those doors, the Visari would know they were coming. But they had no choice. The unknown force, whatever it was, had to be stopped. "There's a secondary entrance," Kira said, pointing ahead to a small hatch on the far side of the hall. It was barely visible, tucked into a corner, but it led directly into the heart of the control center. If they took it, they could avoid being spotted by the primary Visari patrols and buy themselves a few precious minutes. Jarek's eyes flicked over the layout of the hall, assessing the new path. The plan was risky. There were too many variables, but it was their best shot. "Let's go," he said, the words clipped and sharp. They darted toward the hatch, moving quickly and quietly, barely making a sound. The air felt colder as they approached, the metal beneath their feet sending a shiver up Jarek's spine. They could hear the distant voices of Visari soldiers moving through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by the walls. But the silence in the hallway was suffocating. Kira reached the hatch first, her fingers working quickly as she disengaged the lock. The soft click was almost deafening in the quiet tension that surrounded them. With a nod from Jarek, she swung the hatch open, revealing the darkened interior of the control center. The faint buzz of the station's internal systems hummed in the background, a low but constant reminder that they were running out of time. Jarek motioned for Kira to move first, and she slipped through the hatch, her movements quick and calculated. Jarek followed closely behind, his senses alert to every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows. As they crossed the threshold into the control center, the air seemed to shift. The hum of the station was louder here, more intense, as if the very walls of the room were alive, responding to their presence. The control center was vast, lined with terminals and displays, all flashing with chaotic data streams. Laser plasma displays lit up the far walls, casting an eerie glow over the room. The seats at each terminal were empty, and for a moment, Jarek felt the strange weight of that silence. But it was fleeting. The Visari were coming, and they wouldn't be gone for long. "We need to get to the main console," Jarek said, his voice low but urgent. He could feel the pull of the unknown signal in the air, a tangible pressure that seemed to emanate from the control hub itself. Every step he took toward it felt like a step toward a confrontation he couldn't avoid. Kira was already at the far side of the room, her fingers flying over the console with practiced ease. She was in her element here, working quickly to isolate the control systems and access the data feeds. Jarek moved toward her, his gaze scanning the room. The Visari might not have been here yet, but they wouldn't be far behind. "This is it," Kira said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I'm in." Jarek looked over her shoulder at the data flashing across the laser plasma display. The signal was stronger now, clearer, but it was also more dangerous. It was originating from the heart of the station, the core systems, the very heart of the Visari Empire here. The unknown force was tethered to the station, feeding off its energy, and in turn, feeding into their every movement. "We need to sever the connection," Jarek said, his eyes narrowing. "Now." He tapped the console, his fingers moving faster than his thoughts. Kira followed his lead, her fingers flying over the controls as they worked in tandem. The temperature in the room seemed to shift, the air becoming heavier as they disrupted the signal. Sweat beaded on Jarek's brow, but his focus never wavered. The plan was unfolding, each action deliberate, each choice calculated. The flickering lights overhead stuttered as the disruption took hold. The Visari's automated systems began to fail, one by one. The signal's pulse slowed, and the heavy weight that had pressed against Jarek's chest began to ease, but it wasn't over yet. The Visari would be coming soon, and they would be furious. "They'll be here any second," Kira said, her voice steady but urgent. Jarek's eyes snapped to the doorway. He could already hear the distant sounds of soldiers moving toward the control center. They had moments left. "We finish this here," Jarek said, the words hard as stone. He didn't wait for Kira's response. He knew what needed to be done. The plan was set. They had disrupted the signal. Now they had to escape and live to fight another day. The control room fell silent, the last flicker of the laser plasma displays fading into a stillness that pressed down on Jarek like an anvil. The signal was severed. The data streams that had once bombarded them with confusing, erratic bursts of information had slowed, then stopped. The air in the room was thick with tension, and Jarek's hands trembled as he wiped them against his uniform. His heart still raced, but the adrenaline that had surged through him moments ago was now fading, replaced by an overwhelming sense of finality. Kira's fingers paused over the console, her eyes locked on the now still display, her breath shallow. They had done it. They had disrupted the signal, stopped the force that had threatened to tear everything apart. For a moment, Jarek allowed himself to believe that they might have won. Then the door crashed open with a violent jolt, and reality came crashing down. The Visari stormed in, their insectoid forms towering over them, their weapons raised. The tension in the room shattered as Jarek instinctively raised his weapon, his eyes meeting Kira's in a brief, silent exchange. This was the moment they had been preparing for. But something had changed. The Visari soldiers, hardened, calculating, paused. They were close, but they hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed their faces like a crack in the armor they had so carefully constructed over centuries of dominance. For a split second, Everything seemed suspended in the thick, oppressive air of the control room. And then slowly, a voice rose from behind the Visari ranks. It was deep, resonant, its tone carrying a weight that made the air itself feel heavy, almost suffocating. "We have underestimated you," the voice rumbled, the words slowly cutting through the tension. Jarek's breath caught in his throat as he looked up to see the Visari commander, his towering form shadowed in the doorway. His eyes, glinting with a cold, calculating intelligence, locked onto Jarek's. He was silent for a long moment, almost as though savoring the weight of his words. "You speak our dead language," the commander continued, his voice low but full of admiration. No, it was something else, something more like recognition. "The very one we thought lost to time, and you have used it to break through every lock we've set." He stepped forward, his steps slow and deliberate, his presence almost suffocating in its intensity. Jarek didn't lower his weapon, his fingers gripping the hilt tightly. He knew what this moment meant, what the commander was trying to do. This wasn't just about strategy anymore. This was a test, a question. "You think you can stop us," Jarek said, his voice rough but unwavering. "You think you've won because you're ancient, because your legacy has lasted centuries. But you haven't seen what we're capable of." The Visari commander's mandibles twitched in what could almost be considered a smile, but Jarek could see through it. The Visari had always underestimated humanity, and that had been their mistake. "We have never been so close to our enemies, nor have we ever been so blind," the commander said softly. "But you have shown us something new. You have shown us that what we believe to be dead can live again." For a moment, there was no sound but the pounding of Jarek's pulse in his ears. The room seemed to shrink, the weight of the commander's words settling in like lead. But Jarek didn't flinch. He had come too far to back down now. "You haven't won," Jarek said, his voice strong, his words a declaration. "This is our fight now. You thought you could silence us, push us aside, but we're not afraid anymore." Kira stepped forward beside him, her eyes locked on the Visari commander. She stood tall, not backing away. And in that moment, they were no longer just two soldiers on the run. They were part of something bigger. They were humanity's voice. The commander looked at them both for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he lowered his weapon. It was a small gesture, but one that held the weight of their success. The Visari were forced to recognize it, to see them as more than mere insects to be crushed underfoot. "You have earned your place," the commander said, his voice heavy with an unfamiliar respect. "And yet, I wonder if you fully understand the cost of this." Jarek straightened, his eyes unwavering. "We've always understood the cost. We've never been afraid to pay it. For a long time there was only silence, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence that comes after the storm has passed, the kind of silence that only exists after a battle is fought, and the enemy stands before you, recognizing something they had not before. "We are the product of the past," the commander finally said, his voice somber but filled with an odd reverence. "But you are the future." His words hung in the air, thick with meaning. "And in the end, it is not the past that will determine the future. It is you." Jarek felt the weight of the commander's words settle over him, a quiet storm in his chest. This was the victory they had fought for. Not just to win the battle, but to change the course of the future. "We are not your enemies," Jarek said, his voice low but powerful, filled with a quiet strength. "But if you continue to stand in our way, we will do what we must." The commander's eyes flickered with something akin to understanding. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and in that single gesture, the Visari forces seemed to shift. The oppressive weight of their presence lifted, and for the first time in the history of their species, the Visari recognized that they were not the only ones who held power in the galaxy. The walls of the control room hummed to life again, the stations and consoles around them sparking as if waking from a long slumber. The flickering displays now seemed almost subdued in the quiet aftermath, but Jarek didn't need to look at them. He knew what was happening. Humanity had won. The commander turned, motioning to his troops, his expression unreadable. "You've proven yourselves," he said quietly as he began to walk away. "We will let you be. For now." Jarek's grip on his weapon loosened, but he didn't lower it. The Visari were leaving. The battle was over, but the fight for their future had just begun. As the commander and his soldiers retreated, the weight of what had just transpired began to sink in. Humanity had made its mark. The Visari had learned that the language of their ancestors, the language of power, of binding agreements, was not theirs alone. It was humanity's as well. The power of that realization hung in the air like a thread of destiny. Humanity had spoken, and the galaxy would listen.